You stick to a lot of the things that you can control, such as, the brands you typically buy and so on.
Some of the responsibility needs to stay with the retailer and the brand.
The past couple of years in research in terms of consumer behavior has been, really, really revealing.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Next Gen Retail Pod. And as always, we are a curious bunch sitting here at Mariatorget in Stockholm. And today I am particularly curious about human behavior or consumer behavior in crisis. Given the situation around us now with lots of wars and there's inflation, there's lots of stuff that is going on that is affecting us, both I guess then mentally, psychologically, and also then our wallet, or the size of our wallets. I think it's interesting to really understand and not just guess what is going on. So together with me today I have Dr. Jonas Colliander, who's an associate professor at the Stockholm School of Economics. And he has done lots of research and been in lots of TV couches and conferences and stuff discussing this based on his research on how the COVID crisis affected our behaviors as consumers. Before we go into that in depth, I just want you to introduce yourself a bit more, because there's of course more to you than crisis research. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Briefly then, as you said, I'm a researcher at the Stockholm School of Economics. I'm with our Center for Retailing, where we do a lot of different kinds of research, but sort of with retail as the common denominator. So I do a lot of stuff on digital communication, influencers, and also e-retailing basically is my field of research. And I've been doing that for 15 years, teaching, researching. So it's I've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, and I remember because we've known each other for a while, because I was part of Center for Retailing.
I was just going to say, when are you going to get to that part?
No.
That you're actually,
but we were doing some stuff together, and at that time, like 10 years ago, you were early looking at the influencers and why influencers were so influential. So I think just a couple of sentences on how that works.
Yeah, a couple of sentences. That's a tall order to summarize that in a couple of sentences. But essentially, influencers are viewed by a lot of people not as external sources of information, but as information from friends and acquaintances. And those are much more powerful as sort of recommendations than sort of commercial information that we get from advertising or other forms of communications. And as a result, you sort of past that filter of suspicion that we have towards communication, and their advice are much more likely to influence you in purchase decisions. And with that comes, of course, a lot of other conditions for when and under what circumstances they will be effective. So they need to be authentic, they need to be genuine, and all that stuff. So that's, in a nutshell, what that research has shown in a lot of different contexts. So image-wise on Instagram and text-wise on Twitter or X or whatever it's called this week. And, so that's essentially the influencer research.
Yeah. No, and I know it's difficult to, that's like 3 pod episodes in itself, but I still think it's interesting just to understand like the authenticity and the feeling of people being your friend and what effects that has on us. And we see that, I guess, everywhere. People in different aspects influencing us.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, essentially what's happening is that you get a feeling of a perception of knowing an individual, or illusion of intimacy, as it's formally called, and with a lot of individuals. And that's something you saw like in the early TV research also, like people in the early days developed their relationships with characters on TV. That's what product placements and stuff came about. And this feeling that someone, it sort of comes with a lot of exposure to people, to influencers in their daily lives. You see what they what they eat, whom they date, what their apartments look like, and all these things. So essentially, as you follow them over time, you get a feeling that you sort of know them, and that feeling, even though you never met them, this feeling that you know someone all about, you know so much about them, about their habits and whatever, and that sort of gives this feeling of this illusion of intimacy.
Yeah. I remember I felt very affiliated to J.R. Ewing at the time, and I don't know if we should dwell into what that means. But let's move a little bit more then into crisis and what happens to us and what sticks. And as I said, I know that you've done several presentations and been discussing this. But how would you go about then dissecting what? How these crises affect us? I
mean, essentially, it all starts in your head. Sort of the feeling you get, or the feelings you get from being in the midst of a crisis, whether or not that's a natural disaster or a COVID pandemic or inflation, and you have to sort of your finances are being stretched and whatever. And basically a couple of things happens. You start to feeling a loss of control over your own life, your own situation. And you start to think about, possible outcomes and ifs and buts and all these things. And those things combined take up a lot of mental energy. And this feeling of loss of control sort of causes a feeling of, depending on the severity of the situation, it can be anything from sort of fear to anxiety to unease, sort of along that spectrum, so to speak. And that feeling is, obviously something that is very uncomfortable for us. And as a result, we often change our behaviors. Not a lot of things, actually. And you know this from your time in research on consumer behavior. There's very little that will cause, consumers to change their habits in a major way. But, a crisis, suddenly a severe crisis, but to a certain extent also like smaller crisis will cause changes in behavior. New life situations will arise if you have to move and all these things. So these things do cause a lot of changes, and a lot of those changes we see today come from that sort of feeling of loss of control, a lot of cognitive energy being taken up, and sort of course, the consequences of everything that's going on. During COVID, you had to suddenly, from one week to the next, you had to start working from home, and you have to then develop new habits. A lot of people lost their jobs, and all of these things, and crises and new habits form as a result of it.
So basically, you kind of need to reevaluate lots of things because of this lack of control.
Yeah, yes and no. You have to reevaluate a lot of things in your life at the same time as you sort of stick, as a way of maintaining that control, you stick to a lot of the things that you can control, such as, the brands you typically buy and so on, the brands that are sort of comfort brands you tend to stick to a lot. Whereas, new situations cause new behavior, obviously. If you have to work from home, you will change your lunch habits, the way you dress, the equipment you need, the sort of setup you have in your house and all these things. So they sort of force you into new habits and new ways.
I have been at least saying, let's see if that is true, then when things
it's
are in
probably
flux.
True if you've been saying it.
When things are in flux and you're a bit uncomfortable with things and you need to kind of reevaluate stuff, you will also change quite a lot of behaviors. And maybe evaluate other brands or other opportunities, go to different stores. We have seen, especially in like the grocery market now, with maybe people having less money, you change where you go. You change a little bit how you shop. And some of that is pretty big changes compared to what we usually see, because many habits are very, very difficult to change. Yeah. As you say, is it, and I've gone around saying that this is an opportunity for many brands. Is that so, or?
Yeah, I would agree. There's something called, in research, there's something called behavioral primacy. And it's basically once you enter a new situation of sort of any kind, the bigger, the more the effect. But typically it's like when you move to a new city, when you change your jobs, when you move to a new apartment, when you get a kid, all these things, or when you're in sort of dire financial straits, then you tend to form new habits and try new things and try out new brands. But the kicker is that once you try out those new things, since you're sort of a lot of your cognitive energy is being spent on this sort of loss of control and sort of thinking about different scenarios and all that, if you find something in a new situation that works, then you tend to stick with that brand. So you sort of conserve mental energy and sort of having to make new decisions every time you go to the store. So when you make decisions in a new situation and you actually are able to, you as a brand, if you're able to catch, quote unquote, the consumer in that situation and get them to buy your products, as long as it satisfies whatever need it is they have, they tend to be loyal for quite a long time. So especially in times of change, when things are changing a lot, and a lot of consumers are sort of trying out new things and new ways and go to new stores and whatnot, if you manage to capture them in that moment when they try out new categories and things like that, then you have an opportunity to sort of have a at least behaviorally loyal customer for a long time. So it is a big opportunity for a lot of brands. That change is happening, not 2 years from now. It's happening now. It's been happening since early 2020, essentially, when all this started with COVID.
Yeah, but tell me a little bit about like the COVID research you did and what you found.
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of sort of desktop, and we tried basically to find, since it's a major pandemic. It was the first in 100 years. This was like the Spanish flu was the last one in the 1920s, or late teens, early 20s. And so we tried to find like research and try to make research that sort of explained what was happening in that situation. But it wasn't, of course, easy to find anything like that because no one had experienced that situation. So what we did was we compiled, I should say, a lot of stuff from other situations. What happens in sort of natural disasters? What happens when people are sort of caught in the middle of an epidemic like SARS in Hong Kong in 2003? So what we did was basically we synthesized all that, and that's where the findings that I just mentioned, that you sort of loss of control, the mental things that are going on, and we tried to apply that to a lot of the situations that we saw. So we saw basically that in these situations, people tend to sort of shift their habits. First of all, people tend to go, e-retailing got a big boost in Hong Kong in 2003 because obviously you don't want to be close to someone if there's infectious diseases out. Saw the same thing during COVID, obviously. But the really interesting findings was that once this crisis then subsides, then the levels of e-retailing didn't go back to the original levels. What happens was that it served as a catalyst essentially. So they were lower, the levels of e-retailing from peak SARS in that case, but they still remained at a much higher level than they had been before. So it served as a catalyst for a new type of behavior. Similarly, we saw sort of things on long-term effects when we looked at Hurricane Katrina, for example, in New Orleans in, I think it was 2005. So we saw basically that, people become much more cautious when they buy new things. They take more time for a lot of new purchases. They spend a lot more money and effort on sort of emotionally meaningful products and so on. So we tried to piece together that research and try to explain what we saw, sort of the behavior we saw that was happening during COVID. And that combined with sort of the economic downturn and the massive changes we saw when it comes to remote work and people's daily situations sort of explained a lot of the behaviors that we saw in terms of new product category and extreme changes in certain categories like certain dress categories and foods and furniture and whatnot. So I could spend all day talking about it essentially, but it was really interesting to try to explain some of the behaviors in a situation that nobody had experienced for 100 years, and try from the very limited pieces of information that were out there on related but yet different situations to piece together what we can expect going forward. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine happened, and then inflation happened as a result, which we hadn't seen really at this rate since the 70s. So the past couple of years in research and in consumer behavior, all fields of research, so economic research basically, but in terms of consumer behavior has been, really, really revealing when it comes to seeing sort of what comes next and how people behave under crisis situations. And they behave sometimes very predictably, but other times when it comes to sort of using brands, for example, as more of an identity signal to maintain this level of control that you need in very uncertain situations, was one of those things that we saw quite clearly.
Yeah. So basically, what you said is that some things will go back to normal, or will. But you said that the e-tailing curve at least shifted. What do you see? What do you believe are behaviors that we see now that are kind of forced upon us then because of the crisis that will stick, and what will go back? Do you have any? I know it's a bit of asking a researcher to do those kinds. So you will just get an answer that I will look at that later on. But is there anything that you believe will stick?
I mean, I don't know for how long, but certain behaviors will definitely stick. I mean, the working from home, I mean, that's the biggest change in like 100 years we've seen in terms of how people work and where people go, and demographic shifts because of work and all these things. And that, it's something that will probably, increase, and people will find new solutions, but it will never go away. So we'll see this sort of type of 3 days from home, 2 days in the office kind of work. People move farther away from bigger cities maybe to sort of to commute, and that will have an effect on those communities and sort of the people renting or letting out office buildings. So there's a lot of shifts that will come out of that. But let's not also forget that those opportunities to work in a very flexible way, they are sort of limited to people with sort of our kinds of jobs, researchers, people who work at agencies and so on, people sort of white-collar professionals, if you want to be very broad about it. Whereas people like, police officers, bus drivers, all those people with those kinds of jobs, nurses, they don't have that same opportunity. So one of the things we're really interested in seeing is if those kind of the inequality effects are actually being sort of, or the inequality gap is actually widening as a result of this shift. So that's one thing that I think will be very interesting to see moving forward, and something that I think will definitely stick. Now, in the short term or the medium term, I think we haven't seen the sort of peak in
crisis.
Sort of, well, I don't know crisis, but sort of behavior in groceries as a result in groceries, people going to sort of lower cost chains, because I think what we see is that people sort of try to maintain sort of a facade of normalcy, even though it's getting tight financially. So people try to maintain that facade and still going to the same store. A lot of the shift we've seen, I believe, to a lot of chains has been sort of people who are more flexible in where they shop. They go more to these low cost chains. But once this thing really starts to hit home and it's getting really painful, then I think we will see more people out of necessity being forced to those chains. Even though we see sort of a little bit of a drop again for those chains right now, I think that we'll see a second bump, so to speak, in that behavior.
Yeah, we hope that this crisis will not last that much longer. But of course, there are still some things that needs to, I guess, bottom out and to before things get better, maybe.
Yeah.
Looking at other research or things that you do now, is there anything that is happening, of course, in your life, in your head, but also in general? Are there any like especially interesting retail research topics that people talk about?
I mean, there's nowadays there's a lot of there's new research coming out on sort of the role of various formats of physical store versus people are predicting the death of the physical store for a long time, but we see a lot of papers and a lot of research coming out on new roles for the store and sort of what the store mean to the consumer, and basically that, paraphrase, I don't know what the quote is, but the rumor about my death is considerably exaggerated or something like that. Sort of that was a terrible way. I was just paraphrasing on that quote, but it's basically what's coming out is that people have sort of underestimated the resiliency of the physical store, basically. So a lot of that is coming out. We at our department are looking at, or I and a bunch of colleagues are looking at, various effects on various sustainability related retail research, obviously. So there's a lot of stuff going on inventory management, operations, and sustainability. We're also looking at a lot at returns and delivery methods when it comes to the consumer research, how different delivery methods affect the rate of returns, how different payment methods affect the rate of returns, because if you can buy now and pay later, you don't have sort of a mental or psychological ownership of the products yet, so that you're more likely to return perhaps, and those things. So, I mean, the sustainability part of retailing has been important for retailers for a long time, but it's also very, very prominent, very important for research at the moment.
And I think the returns is that's a very interesting topic that you can talk for a long time about also, where I believe that the return rates can of course go down a lot, but I also believe that some of the responsibility needs to stay with the retailer and the brand. Because sometimes I think it's pushed a bit too much to the consumer, and it's we had a sustainability pod episode some months ago, and we actually talked a little bit about that, and then I got agreement then from the business side that there is a big responsibility then on business not to shift to just exclude people from being able to return or increase the cost of returns, just to make sure that you decrease it that way. Because some things that are, if garments for example in fashion are not used, that's the worst thing for sustainability.
I mean, it's so complex, sort of what happens with return garments and the systems you have in place for taking care of it. And I mean, there's that, again, that's another topic we could spend a day or two talking about, but it's a lot of stuff going on there.
Cool, but let's not do another talk, at least not now, on returns, but just thanks a lot for this conversation. I think there are lots of interesting things, of course, when things are in flux and things are changing, and we're forced to change our behaviors then for some kind of external crisis reason, and what will then stick and what will not stick. And maybe there's a reason to have you back in a year or so, or earlier, when things have turned.
I mean, if only I could then predict when things will turn, so we can have a firm date on that.
And we'll schedule a date, and then we'll make sure that it has happened.
Exactly. We'll decide when the crisis is over.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonas. Take care.
Thank you.